myself here a little bit. You can probably tell I'm not from Long Island. I'm an Alabama boy, born and raised 8 miles from where I presently live. I married an Indiana gal who is visiting with her mother about 50 miles from here. We have 3 grown children. They're married. We have grandchildren in each of them, and we thank the Lord for God's graciousness to us. There's a truth from Proverbs that the glory of old men is the children's children. And I've become convinced in time that God reserves that particular pleasure for the time that you become a grandparent. You can have all kinds of theories about it, but what a joy it is to raise future generations in the knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. My pastor is Myron Mooney. For those of you that know Pastor Mooney, no introduction is necessary. He makes sure that he gets introduced wherever he goes. His remarkable qualities are 2 that stand out to me. One is that my pastor has the most genuine compassion for humanity of any person I have ever met in my life. His love for both the elect and the lost is just something to behold, and it's been a great gift to our lives from the Lord. And then secondly, he has a memory for names that is unbelievable. Incredible names. I went to a reenactment down in a little town called Childersburg, Alabama, with him, and there must have been 50 people that walked up. He hadn't been there in 8 years. He knew everybody's name. He knew who they were married to. He knew their children, but he didn't know who the children had married and what the name of their kids were yet. Me, that doesn't work like that. So I thank you for allowing me to come up and asking me to do so. Your pastor ran across my passion for this guy named Pierre Viret through our presbytery and my horn tooting of Pierre Viret. I asked around, how many people ever heard of Pierre Viret? How many here have, prior to this, had heard of Pierre Viret? Okay, we got a couple of 3. Pierre Viret is one of the most outstanding stories of the Reformation era. It is inspiring to understand his story. And how we could lose a treasure like this is almost unbelievable unless we consider that God hid this treasure for such a time as we live in today. And I think that there's merit to that case. Secondly, all of you young people, you young men and you young ladies, I'm going to tell Pierre Viret's story by telling stories. But I will share with you just one thing out of my work endeavors. Over the years, we have run a mentoring and an apprenticeship program in my business endeavors. We have had about between 350 and 400 young men come through that program. And my sole determination that I hope by God's grace to have an impact on is that for most of the youth in our generation, we have set our standards so low, it takes them a while, but they eventually get down to it. I don't believe that, and I don't believe that was ever God's intention for young people. I have watched young people, you young men, hear me. I have watched young men, when you set those standards high, impossibly high, not only by God's grace achieve those standards, but far exceed them. Pierre Viret is an example story for you young ladies. He has been brought back to life to the American or the English-speaking audience by R.A. Sheets, a self-taught student of Pierre Viret, who trained in the speaking of the French language on her own. Read voraciously about this guy, wondering how we could lose it. And then wrote Pierre Viret, the Angel of the Reformation, R.A. Sheets is Rebecca A. Sheets. A young woman whom God is using mightily to bring alive again a jewel of the Reformation. Well, I want to give you kind of a quick outline of what I'm going to be talking about. And if I appear to be a little passionate about the subject, you are correctly perceiving what's going on. Pierre Viret was involved in some of the most momentous times of the Reformation era. And I want to share with you tonight about his life and his character. I want to tell you stories about his life. What a fascinating story this man is. He had some pretty unique friends. You ever heard of this guy named William Farel? Farel was a buddy of his, sort of. A buddy that kept getting him in trouble. Everybody needs a buddy like William Farel. And then he had this other friend who, he in fact was this man's closest friend. And this is what shocked me. His name was John Calvin. How did we lose the closest friend John Calvin had? Amazing, isn't it? But we did. The letters between these guys are fascinating, and I'll tell you the story. Calvin, after Viret lost his first wife and was so stricken with sadness over his first wife, John Calvin was such a close and loving friend of Pierre Viret that he did the only thing a close friend could do. He went out and found him another wife. And Viret married her on the say-so of one guy named John Calvin. So, for you ladies or you men in your future, get you a close friend, problem solved. Pierre Viret, I want to talk to you this evening about his life and his character. If you've read Martin Luther's great work, The Bondage of the Will, you notice that Mr. Luther has a penchant for name-calling. Fairly serious name-calling. And Mr. Luther wasn't alone during that era. That was a fairly common method of communicating your thoughts about other people whom you were having theological disputes with. Mr. Viret rose above that type of language in his disputes. Not that there wasn't truth to it, but he carried a character that was different. Tomorrow I want to talk about Viret's theology and his influence, and particularly his influence then. Most people, you know who the Huguenots are, right? The last 10 years of his life, Pierre Viret was the leader, the recognized leader of the Huguenots. Did his greatest work during that time. And the treatise that he did on the Ten Commandments during those years is considered by those of his contemporaries the greatest treatise of the Ten Commandments written during the Reformation era. Fascinating. And you all heard about that in your theology classes, right? We didn't. But not only so, but his influence today. When you understand Viret's theology, I think you'll understand not only his influence then, but what I believe will become his influence today, because we need the influence of Pierre Viret. In the church world today, the fragmentation, the lack of moral disciplines that surrounds the church is incredible. And then lessons to take away from what we study about Viret. One, I want to talk to the young people about lessons to take away from Pierre Viret. You'll figure out why. But I want to tie into that. How many of you know who the St. Andrew Seven is? You ever heard of them? Okay, the St. Andrew Seven. And then I want to introduce you to John Eliot. You know who that guy is? John Eliot, and fellows, you should know this guy, David Brainerd. All of these oldsters that we know. But as young people, there are things visions that will make life significant in the Lord Jesus Christ. The second one is to us older guys. One of my greatest disappointments in my work in the church is to see my generation disengaged from your generation. It's horrible. And when the truth is that what us older men and older women ought to be doing, we ought to be so engaged with the future generation serving Jesus Christ to inspire them, to help them. After all these years, the wisdom we should have to be able to help them. So I want to talk to us about that. And then the final thing, and then this is on Sunday, I want to talk to you about the influence of character and why character in the Christian life is the greatest attribute you have in terms of your personal self in the world around you. So with that in mind, I'm going to start in and I'm going to tell you stories about this guy named Pierre Viret. Let's set a time frame for it. My scripture that I use, and you'll understand why, is Matthew 5 and 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. 6 years before October 31st, 1517, a fellow by the name of Martin Luther goes up to the church door at Wittenberg and he posts what became famously known as the 95 Thesis. And somebody copies it down and prints it, and everywhere on the continent there's this rising flame of inquiry. But 6 years prior to that day, in a little place called Orbe, Switzerland, was born the second son of Julie and Viret. His name was Pierre. So he's 6 years old when all of this breaks out. Well, to give you a little better time frame, there's another guy by the name of Antoine Formet. You ever heard of this guy? Okay, this was a guy who was in a place called, you might have heard of this, Geneva. Okay? Before, there was a guy there named Calvin. We generally associate Calvin with Geneva, don't we? I mean, it's like Geneva was born when Calvin was born. But this guy was born in 1508, so he was 3 years older than Pierre Viret. There was another guy named William Farrell. He was born in 1489. This guy was old when Viret came along. He was 22 already. And he lived until 1565. And then there was another guy that was born 2 years before Pierre Viret. His name was John Calvin. And then there was another guy that was born 8 years later by the name of Theodore Beza. Heard of that guy, right? He followed Calvin to Geneva. Okay? So this kind of gives you an idea of what God was putting together at this time. And this young fellow was born there in Orbe, Switzerland. And it was written of him, though much can be made of Viret's attributes, accomplishments, influence, and theological output, the first and foremost and most obvious aspect of Viret's life was his exemplary character. His faithfulness to God, his conduct in speech, and his relationships with friends and foe alike truly set him apart among the 16th century reformers. As you read Viret, you can't help but notice the difference. There is a gentleness and a kindness in the midst of some of the most awful persecution to Viret's character that you will ever read or witness. In history, it's remarkable. And one scholar noted it like this: Viret did not fall into the trap of Protestant scholasticism with its endless abstractions. And a lot of times, you can read the Puritans, and all of us, most, hopefully, are reading a lot of Puritans. And sometimes they're the only guys I've ever read that could take 2 words and write 2,000 pages on it. You ever notice that? They just could do that. And, but Viret wrote differently. He wrote his theological works immensely practical in dealing with the very issues of everyday life. So this young man was born. He was raised there, and his mother and father were very devout Roman Catholics. His father was a tailor. And so they were kind of okay in terms of their economic influence and lifestyle. And then he went to school locally. His father, wise dad, noticed that he had a gift for like thinking and putting together concepts. And so his father sent him to this school, and there was this guy there by the name of Mark Romaine, his school teacher. And years later, Viret wrote about this school teacher in this little town called Orbe, Switzerland. Here's what Viret said about his teacher. In a community devoutly Catholic, he began in our early years, says Viret, to remove us from barbarianism and sophistry, and not only so, but to instruct us in our letters, but was also the first to give us a taste of the gospel and incite us to study and pursue it. So here was this guy, Romaine. He slides into Orbe, Switzerland, and there were rumors that abounded in the town that Romaine was of those lecherous Lutheran leanings. But the rumors did not yet reach a cascade. So Romaine taught his students and prepared a future group of people to hear the gospel in a most unique way. But he soon got in trouble, as we will discover. The treacherousness of his Lutheran leanings could not keep him treacherously upright before the population for long. But at the age of 16, this young guy named Pierre Viret goes off to college. His parents say there was no school around there. They sent him to the Collège de Montaigu of Paris. You ever heard of that college? It ought to be on everybody's tongue because that's where John Calvin went to school. And you know what we figured out in reading all this stuff on Viret was that in order to learn how to pronounce these names correctly, they had to send it down to us Southern folks because they just didn't get it right. But not only did John Calvin attend that school, there was another guy that attended that school. His name was Erasmus. Heard of that guy? And so this is where Pierre Viret went to school from the age of 16 to the age of 20. And during this time, Pierre Viret becomes convinced of the Protestant faith. And he tells his story very simply, how God brought him to faith in Jesus Christ alone. In Paris. In Paris in those years, now he's 20, so this is from 1527 to 1531. Paris is not the place to go around boasting about the fact that you're a Protestant, unless you mean it. It was not likely that they had false believers in Paris in those days. And so, in the wisdom of his 20 years, Viret leaves in the midst of persecution. At 20 years old, this young man is already enduring persecution. Like all of you young folk, right? The severe persecution that you undergo when your parents want you to do your chores and clean up around the house. How can you possibly live with this kind of life? But this is what happened to young believers then. So he goes back to Orbe where he lives. His parents are Catholic. When he gets back there, there's this guy that comes into town riding on a white horse with spurs by the name of William Farel. If you know the history of William Farel has a heritage into the Piedmont Mountains. You know who was in the Piedmont Mountains, right? The Waldensians. 1,000 years that this place up in the mountains have been able to pass on the gospel from father to son to mother to daughter, and they kept on and they endured this persecution. Well, this was the heritage of a guy named William Farel. He comes into Orbe, and there's all this political intrigue, and you can read it in the book. It's well worth knowing. But in the middle of this political intrigue and all this stuff going on, and Luther's got stuff stirred up and all this, in comes William Farel, and he begins to preach right after they did a town survey and found out that there were a grand total in all of Orbe of 8 people who openly opposed Catholicism. And in comes William Farel, true to his call. And he begins to preach. And of course, they begin to go after William Farel. And then they discover that there is just this certain group of people that are faithful to attend all of his lectures. And among that is a young 20-year-old boy. We say boy today, don't we? Farel saw with different eyes. That young man was one Pierre Viret. Young folks, listen. Tradition has it that at that age, Viret had memorized the entirety of Scripture by heart. Fascinating, isn't it? And so he said, and listen, he's a shy, kind of a timid guy. And Farel puts his eye on him. Now, can you imagine a guy like Farel putting his eye on you? I mean, a guy who had faced death over and over and over and over again. And he puts his eye on you. It could just be daunting. But he did. And finally, he convinces Viret that Viret has to preach. Farel had preached there for a month, and Viret had listened to him. And he finally cajoles Viret into preaching. Okay, so here is this guy born in 1489 that in 1531, he's 42 years old, and he sees this young 20-year-old young man who he found qualities in, who'd already been persecuted and run out of Paris. He was there in the midst of this tremendous tension. And he said, you have to preach. Well, Viret preached his first sermon on May the 6th, 1531. Now, here's the interesting thing. Farel preached there and got no converts. The next Passover, Pierre Viret served communion to 77 believers. But his preaching was entirely different than William Farel's. Viret had a gentleness to his preaching, and he spoke softly and kindly and entreatingly. And so he speaks very kindly of his first congregation years later. And so the Lord blesses his work there. Now, how many of us would think of a 20-year-old young man leading a congregation in the midst of opposition in a town where 8 people only were openly opposed to the dominant religion of the time? We don't do that today, do we? Does that tell us anything about our expectations of youth? I'm afraid it might. Because this guy Farel had done with young boys, or young men. And so he preaches there, and 2 of his converts were his mother and his father that were brought to the gospel. So this guy he becomes renowned in his area. He's a homeboy. Now, what was interesting is that all of a sudden, all the Catholic people would come and crowd where he's preaching. They didn't come because they agreed with him. They come because he's a homeboy. But there was another reason, and they wrote about it. They never heard anyone speak of the gospel of Jesus Christ like that. There was something about this guy's relationship with Christ that was attractive. And they weren't his enemies. Well, he worked there, and he continued to work, laboring in his misguided 20-year-old youth very successfully into his 21 years of misguided youth. That was very successful. And then the next thing that happens is there's this guy named William Farel. Farel starts another debate. Can you imagine Farel doing this? Farel starts another debate, and he says, well, I got this thing stirred up, so I need some help. Viret, I need your help. So he calls Viret. And he goes over to Payerne, and then he goes to Neuchâtel, and then back to Payerne, and by this time it's 1533. We now have an experienced pastor and mentor and preacher of 2 years. You couldn't ask for anything more. So what happens in the middle of this is that there is a disputation that is to be had. And in a disputation, what it is, it's a legal call from the authorities that requires this brother to present his positions and for that brother to present his positions in a legal audience, as it were. And that's the way it worked back then. And lo and behold, the one guy that was selected to go with Farel was Fremont and this guy named Viret. And so the night before the disputation was to be had the next day, Viret had talked with all of his enemies. He kindly entreated them, shared the gospel with them, debated with them, and he was an example of patiently instructing those that opposed themselves. That was him. So, he's on his way home. He's contemplating the big day tomorrow. And out from behind the bushes, in his back, is the priest he is to debate tomorrow with a sword. 22 years old. And he cuts him up with a sword and leaves him to die. He doesn't die. So he, by God's grace, recovers. 22. I believe, because the history of God's work with his people demonstrates that you young people have it within you by God's grace to have that kind of commitment to Jesus Christ and the cause of the gospel. That's quite a commitment, isn't it? So he starts healing up and he goes back to Orbe, and there's this guy, William Farel, again. Farel goes over to Geneva. So what do you think he does in Geneva? He changes course, right? He does something different than he's ever done. That did not happen. He goes into Geneva and he starts stirring stuff up in Geneva. And he says, well, I need help. So now he calls this guy who is now 23 years old to come to Geneva. And Farel had kind of a rough time there in Geneva himself. Can you imagine? He was kind of like the sandpaper of the Reformation. Okay? If you've ever read on Farel, this guy would have made a sandpaper salesman par excellence. Awesome at getting things started and then calling in the cavalry. And if you were in the cavalry, you better be armed when you come. And so he goes there into Geneva. And he calls in Viret. And they begin to work there. And Viret begins to preach. Now remember how old this guy is. And God so anoints this young man's ministry. He is a peacemaker. He seeks to make peace. He preaches the gospel of peace, men making peace with God. And he has an effect in the city of Geneva that begins to turn the hearts and minds of the people, and he was turning the soil that was being plowed up by this guy named Pierre Viret. And so in the town you have William Farel, Antoine Fremont, and Pierre Viret. And they're staying with a guy by the name of Claude Bernard. He obviously was a supporter of these men. And During this time, they were really getting tired of this guy, William Farel, and this guy, Pierre Viret. People loved listening to him, and he was convincing. So they hatched a plot. And the plot was this. They had a devout Roman Catholic lady by the name of Antonia Fax, who pretended that she was a persecuted Huguenot out of France. And she was able to worm her way into the household, and she became the cook where these men were staying. So she fixed one evening for them. It was on March the 6th of 1535. She fixed for them poison soup. And she served it to them. Well, Froment's wife and daughters, our children, came into town about that time. And he jumps up without eating a thing, and he takes off to go see his wife and his children by God's providence. William Farel takes one taste of it, declares it's too thick, he wants something else to eat. Sandpaper at the table. And so he gets up and leaves. Dear, gentle Viret. Not intending to hurt this woman's feelings. Doesn't want to turn away her food. He ate the whole bowl. And was thankful. Eating his death. Well, his disposition was so convicting till the woman broke out in tears. And she went and got a glass of water. While she's crying, she doesn't even tell him what it is. And just, you have to drink this water. She's hoping it dilutes the poison, right? Because now, perhaps the thou shalt not kill is getting through. And he becomes deathly sick. It haunted him the rest of his life. And he lingered almost to the point of death. But he didn't die. God preserved him. Well, a little bit later, in the course of this, everybody in Geneva heard what happened. And even people who were opposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Protestant Reformation, began to turn against those that would do such diabolical things. You know, that kind of stuff has a way of turning on you. Well, God used it, and it did. And all of a sudden, people who would never have listened to him before would come out and listen to this weak, beggarly youth preach the gospel. Well, one night, they were had gotten news about a traveling fellow. And this guy was coming into town for one night. Let me see if I can find this, because I got to read this to you. And he's only going to be there for one night, and they had heard about him, and he wanted to go off and study. And so he's there for one night, and he gets a visit from this guy named William Farel and Pierre Viret. How many knew that Viret was there during Farel's visit to John Calvin? And Calvin describes it like this later. I had decided to slip through Geneva without stopping more than one night in the town. Now, a short time previously, popery had been thrown out through the instrumentality of this good person above mentioned, Farel, and by Pierre Viret. Wherefore Farel, who was burning with a better zeal for the advance of the gospel. Have you ever heard Farel described better than that? He was just burning with a better zeal for the advance of the gospel. Straightway made every effort to hold me in Geneva. Now, after he had heard that I had some particular study for which I wished to keep myself free, when he saw that he could get nowhere by prayer, he even went as far as a curse, that it might please God to curse my rest and the tranquility for study that I was seeking, if in so great a necessity I were to withdraw and refuse to give my help and assistance. This word frightened me. and shattered me so much that I set aside the journey I had planned. This seems to be the operational technique of Mr. Farrell. He changed a lot of folks' mind over time. But that is how Calvin came to be in Geneva. So then, after this, as sickly as he was, Viret makes his way back into his home area, and he gets called to Lausanne. And there in Lausanne, they had eventually another disputation, and it was there that he won his great fame in the disputation. There was some of the prominent priests, and we're still talking about a young man of 25 years old. That's awesome, isn't it? That is just awesome. And I hope that when we're through with this study that some of you young men and you young ladies are inspired by the life of Pierre Viret. Because God gives you such a zeal. But boy, when he tempers that zeal with character and knowledge of the Scriptures, what a magnificent adornment for the Church of Jesus Christ. Well, he gets over to Lausanne, and he eventually becomes the pastor in this town that is dominantly Catholic. This guy has such a peaceful pastoral life, doesn't he? I mean, imagine the ease with which his calling has given him so far. He goes there, and he becomes the pastor, and he begins to preach, and God begins to bless his ministry there. And it begins to grow. And they saw then in 1537 that there was such a dearth. These ministers were always being called out to go here, to go there, to go other places. And they needed a training academy. So in 1537 in Lausanne, they started an academy. And it was very sparse at first, but it began to grow. And they trained a lot of students. For instance, 2 of the students that came through that academy wrote the Heidelberg Catechism of 1562. Another student wrote the Belgic Confession of 1561. And so it began to grow. The quality of the school, the knowledge of the school, it began to attract all these people. One of my favorite stories about Geneva, by the way, you young ladies will love this story. When I studied this, the impact of the gospel, one of the things as a businessman, I happen to know character impacts economics. Every time, without question, always. So I thought, well, with all this going on in Geneva, I want to do some economic studies. At that time, marriage was a really iffy proposition for you ladies. What we know about the family today is a product of the Protestant Reformation. Puritanism. But what's interesting is when you discover that the men were so well trained there in the art of marriage. Fathers would save up their money for the very purpose of taking their daughters to Geneva to find a husband. Because they wanted their daughters treated like women in the Scriptures. Fascinating story. Someday I'm going to put that together, but when I found that in the story of economics of Geneva, I was just thrilled by it. But that's part of the gospel. So in Lausanne, they started the academy. They had this, and now there were 5 youth. Remember what's going on in France, the rest of France. The persecution of the Huguenots is going on. There's the academy that started. They open up the academy. They take students in. They care for them. They love them. They train them. And they had 5 students that came from France. And their goal was to come there to be trained. The Lord had converted them. They wanted to be trained. And then they wanted to go back to France to preach the gospel to their home country. Marshal Abbot, Pierre Viret, Bernard Seguin, Charles Vaughan, and Pierre Viret. These five young men, came to the academy and studied there, and they wanted to go back, and they got the blessings of Viret, they got the blessings of their professors, and they got the blessings of this one guy by the name of John Calvin, who approved of them going back into the midst of this persecution going on. And these young men who had become the best of friends decided they were going to travel together. And this is important for all of us, but you young people in particular, pick your friends wisely. In the work that I do, in my work world, the most destructive thing I have ever seen for young people is a violation of Psalm 1. Your circle of friends. So these young men get the blessings. They take vow off. They're headed to Lyon, France. And they didn't live in the same area, but they're going there because it's a central city. Then they're going to disperse to where they go. On the way, they meet this guy. And they take him in, they share the gospel with him, they talk to him, he's friendly and all that, and so they find a place to stay while they're in Lyons, and when they sit down to supper that evening, the doors burst open. And in comes the authorities, and they arrest all five of these young men for being heretics. And they put them under the scruples, interrogating them. And they refused to give up their faith. Remarkable testimony of, again, young people who have been genuinely converted to Christ. And their stand for the gospel. And there was intervention by this party, intervention by that party, but to no avail. That happened on April the 30th of 1552. And all five of these young men never made it back to their homes, but gave their lives in Lyon, France, for their testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, shortly after this, in this academy that they built, Theodore Beza came there. He spent 9 years leading that academy. And if you know anything about how the politics of church and state went back then, the church was underneath the authority of the state, or the cantons as it were, and if you were a minister, you got directions from the lords of the canton, the people who were in charge politically. They were also in charge religiously, and they also had controls of things as who could take communion. This was a great issue during the Reformation. And it kept being an issue because guys like Viret thought that if you were a drunkard, an adulterer, maybe you murdered people, that it was probably best if you weren't allowed to take communion. You know, they just thought that could be a problem with that. But if you were politically connected, you could overcome all those moral issues. And that was happening, and the intensity of it was growing. And in 1559, there was this whole series of incidents that basically got Viret fired because he could no longer consciously continue to allow this to happen. So Viret gets fired by the Bernese lords, and in true fashion of brotherhood, all of the principal teachers at the academy resigned. They go 50 miles south. They've been operating for 22 years. They go 50 miles south. Welcomed there tremendously to a town called Geneva. And in Geneva, 2 years later, they started an academy with the fruits that had been grown in Lausanne for 22 years. And it became renowned. And most people do not know that Viret had such a tremendous hand in the formative teachers in Arabic of the academy in Geneva. Well, Viret was welcomed back into Geneva. And if you study the life of Viret there, the thing you discover is that the people in Geneva loved the preaching of Viret and attended it by a huge margin more than a guy named John Calvin, whom they also loved. But Viret was so instrumental in Calvin, time and time again, would try to get this guy to come and help him and work with him. And he would say, oh, my gentle Viret. Now he, oftentimes by the Bernese Wars, by Friedberg, by different ones, even in Geneva, this guy Viret was so known for his peacemaking qualities, they would call him in to settle their disputes. They would want him to be in charge of settling disputes. How about somebody like that in your house? Be good, wouldn't it? Somebody who had such a quality about him that even his enemies believed he would be just. The Roman Catholics, when they had disputes among themselves over certain things, incredibly would call Pierre Viret to help settle the dispute. Can you imagine that? This guy had such a reputation, even his enemies believed in his integrity. Awesome. I wonder if we could convince our enemies of that kind of integrity. It's a good question. Well, after a short stay there, Viret has some health problems. When people cut you up with swords and feed you poison soup, it has a tendency to have ill effects on one's health. And so he was given instructions that it would probably be good for him to go to the south of France. You know what's going on in France now, right? It is not exactly a vacation spot for Protestants at this time. But he goes, and he gets all these requests, and he becomes the leader of the Huguenots over there. One of the cities that he goes into, and he's there for a little while, had just been taken over by the Protestants 6 weeks earlier. There was a particular priest in that town that harassed, killed, done all kinds of evil things to the Protestants, and they finally had the till turned on this guy. And so they had put him on a platform, and they were about to hang him. They were going to burn him. They wanted vengeance on this guy. Up on the platform jumps a sickly, frail figure by the name of Pierre Viret, who pleaded with his Protestant brothers not to take the life of this Catholic persecutor. But if they must have one, to take his. They were so moved by this man's desire to be a peacemaker. They let the priest go, and they let Viret go. A man who hated Viret, no less. Shortly thereafter, our good friend Charles, the king, passed an edict banning all Protestant ministers the preaching of the Protestant gospel from France. And it applied to every single Protestant member under their pastor, preacher, there under the penalty of death, except one. His name was Pierre Viret. The man whose life he saved was very influential. And he had gotten with his other Catholic buddies. And they had petitioned the king, sworn enemies, to let one man stay. Pierre. What a testimony of a desire to be a peacemaker. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. So this is a little bit about Pierre Viret's life. As a young person, I can't imagine that you wouldn't want to learn from this guy. As an older man, I have been so inspired by this man's life. In the middle of disputations, how others might hammer their enemies, Viret would draw them in. How to treat your enemies. What exemplary character this man had. How to be willing to suffer for your faith rather than seek vengeance. What a testimony. So this was Viret. This was his life. He died in the south of France. I didn't get to tell you much about his wife and his second wife, except for how he got her. But it's a fascinating story. But this man he wrote tremendously. Now, tomorrow, we will talk about his theology and his influence with that theology. And I just want to, in closing here, I want to read a statement. Because Viret in his theology, to kind of give you an idea of Viret, the one thing that he did in his theology is Viret believed that the Word of God covered every aspect of life. I mean, there was nothing left out. Today, the teaching that Viret and Zwingli did on, for instance, the just war theory, would be strange to our ears. But you are directly affected by some of the writings of Pierre Viret. And you may not know it. You see, Viret wrote treatises on economics, which happens to be a topic I'm passionate about. And in those treatises, he affected several people, one of them being John Knox. Knox was a Scottish man. And various Scotsmen wrote different things. And on later, there was a Scotsman who was invited to become president of Princeton. His name was John Witherspoon. John Witherspoon was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States as a pastor, preacher. And it was through his economics training that he teamed up with another Reformed fellow by the name of Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman wrote a treatise called A Caveat Against Injustice, or an inquiry into the evils of the fluctuating medium of exchange. Got it? Okay, you're going to be tested on that in 5 minutes. Mr. Witherspoon was responsible for the inclusion of a biblical sound money system being included in the United States Constitution. We no longer use it. But it was Mr. Witherspoon who was responsible for Article 1, Section 10, which says, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin, a tenth, and payment of debt. Came from a Reformed minister. And it goes back to this guy who wrote about it. But I'll leave you with this and see if this reminds you of anything, because when we touch on his theology, we'll touch on this. See if this kind of rings true to you. One of the strangest disparities of history lies between the sense of abundance felt by older and simpler societies and the sense of scarcity felt by the ostensibly richer societies of today. Does that have a ring of truth to it? Well, we'll talk about his theology tomorrow, and I hope that you enjoy learning about Pierre Viret. I love talking about Pierre Viret. That may even be obvious. But one of my favorite characters of history.